The red sands of Orcus 9 stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the twisted metal carcasses of ships that had come before. Captain Mara Reyes pressed her gloved hand against the reinforced viewport of her salvage skiff, watching the alien landscape roll past beneath her. Each wreck told a story of ambition meeting reality, of explorers and fortune-seekers who had underestimated this desolate world's appetite for destruction. The atmosphere outside was paper-thin and laced with toxins that could eat through standard breathing apparatus in hours. Dust storms rolled across the surface with the regularity of clockwork. Some lasting days, others mere minutes, but carrying enough force to strip paint from hull plating. Yet beneath the hostile surface, energy signatures pulsed like a heartbeat, drawing prospectors despite the dangers. Metal shards jutted from dunes at odd angles, catching the weak sunlight and throwing it back in brilliant flashes that could be seen from orbit. Mara had been running salvage operations in the outer systems for 15 years, but Orcus 9 was different. The planet seemed to resist any attempt at permanence, grinding down structures with patient, methodical fury. She'd learned to read the storms, to find the brief windows of calm that allowed her to pick through the graveyards of failed expeditions. Each piece of scrap she recovered was a small victory against the planet's hostility. Her skiff shuddered as it descended toward her latest target, a cluster of wrecks half buried in a valley between two massive dunes. The sand here had a different quality, darker and more compact, suggesting it had been fused by extreme heat at some point in the past. Mara's instruments picked up unusual readings from the site, crystalline signatures that didn't match any known human technology. As she brought the skiff down for landing, a glint of light caught her eye. Not the harsh reflection of metal, but something softer, more organic in its luminescence. She magnified the image on her screen and felt her breath catch. A ship unlike any she'd seen before lay partially exposed in the sand, its hull composed of what appeared to be living crystal that pulsed with inner light. The Caliph vessel was a work of art as much as engineering, where human ships were all hard angles and functional ugliness. This craft seemed to have grown rather than been built. Crystalline structures flowed into each other seamlessly, creating a form that was both alien and somehow perfectly natural. But something was wrong. The light within the crystals flickered erratically, and sections of the hull showed stress fractures that spider-webbed across the surface. Mara suited up with practiced efficiency, double-checking every seal and connection. The recycled air in her helmet tasted metallic, a reminder of how many times the filters had been cleaned and reused. She'd learned long ago that on Orcus 9, redundancy wasn't paranoia, but survival. Her equipment might be cobbled together from a dozen different sources, but it worked, and that was all that mattered. The airlock cycled with a wheeze that suggested the seals needed replacing again. Another item for the ever-growing maintenance list. Mara stepped out onto the red sand, her boots sinking slightly into the fine grains. The gravity here was lighter than Earth normal, giving her movements a slight bounce that had taken weeks to adjust to when she'd first arrived. As she approached the crystalline vessel, movement caught her eye. Figures emerged from what she now recognized as an airlock, though it seemed to Iris open like an organic membrane rather than swing on hinges. The beings that stepped out made her pause mid-stride. The Caliph were humanoid in basic structure, but that was where the similarity ended. Their skin appeared to be composed of the same crystalline material as their ship, refracting light in subtle patterns that shifted with their movements. They stood taller than humans on average, with elongated limbs that moved with a grace that seemed almost choreographed. Their faces were angular, with large eyes that held depths of color she couldn't quite name. One of them stepped forward, and when it spoke, the voice came not from its mouth, but from a translation device worn at its throat. The sound was melodious, despite the mechanical origin, each word carefully pronounced. "We require assistance," the Caliph said. "Our resonance generators have failed. Without them, we cannot maintain our technology. We will perish here." Mara studied the group, 6 of them in total. Their crystalline skin, now that she looked closer, showing signs of stress similar to their ship. Whatever had gone wrong, it was affecting them on a fundamental level. "I'm Captain Mara Reyes," she said, activating her own suit's external speakers. "Independent salvage operator. What happened to your ship?" The lead Caliph, who introduced himself as Chief Engineer Vel, gestured toward their vessel with a movement that seemed to encompass both explanation and despair. "We attempted to establish resonance with this planet's energy signatures. Our matrix could not adapt to the chaotic patterns. The feedback destroyed our primary crystals." Mara walked closer to the ship, running her scanner over the hull. The readings were unlike anything in her database, but she could recognize catastrophic system failure when she saw it. The crystalline structure was literally coming apart at the molecular level, its perfect symmetry disrupted by forces it hadn't been designed to handle. "Your whole technology is based on crystalline resonance?" she asked, already seeing the problem. "No backup systems? No alternative power sources?" Vel's expression, insofar as she could read it on his alien features, seemed to convey shock at the very suggestion. "Our technology has served us for millennia. It requires no alternatives. It is perfect in its function." "Perfect doesn't mean much when it stops working," Mara said, perhaps more harshly than intended. She'd seen too many people die because they'd trusted in systems that couldn't adapt to unexpected conditions. "How long before your life support fails?" "3 of your standard days," Vel replied. "Perhaps 4 if we minimize all activity." Mara looked out across the wasteland of wrecks surrounding them. 3 days to figure out how to save 6 aliens whose technology was completely incompatible with anything she knew. The smart move would be to offer them passage off-world and leave it at that. But she'd made the smart move once before, and 37 colonists had paid the price for her caution. "There's salvage all around us," she said, gesturing to the scattered wrecks. "Human tech, mostly. It's crude compared to what you're used to, but it works. If you're willing to try something different, we might be able to cobble together enough systems to get you operational again." The Caliph exchanged glances, their crystalline features catching and reflecting emotions she couldn't interpret. Finally, Vel spoke. "Our science demands perfection. Without it, we perish." "Perfection's a luxury," Mara countered. "Adaptation keeps us breathing." The silence stretched between them, broken only by the whisper of wind across sand. In the distance, a dust devil swirled briefly to life before dissipating. Finally, Vel nodded, a gesture that seemed to cost him considerably. "Show us your methods." "Captain Reyes, we have little choice but to trust in your adaptation." Mara led them first to her skiff, where she'd accumulated a workshop's worth of tools and spare parts. The Caliph moved carefully through the cramped space, their tall forms having to duck beneath overhead compartments. She could see them taking in the chaos of her organization system, where components from a dozen different manufacturers were sorted by function rather than origin. "This is what I mean by adaptation," she said, pulling out a fusion cutter that had been modified with parts from 3 different tools. "Nothing here matches, but it all works together. That's what we need to do with your ship." She demonstrated the cutter on a piece of scrap plating, the blade adjusting its frequency automatically to match the material's density. One of the younger Caliph, who introduced herself as Ziri, leaned in with obvious interest. "The tool changes itself to match its task," Ziri observed. "This is not entirely unlike our resonance principles, yet achieved through mechanical means." "Exactly," Mara said, warming to someone who seemed willing to see possibilities rather than imperfections. "Now, let's see what we can find in the salvage field." The expedition into the surrounding wrecks was an education in contrasts. Where Mara saw potential in every twisted beam and fried circuit board, the Caliph initially saw only chaos and failure. She had to teach them to look beyond the obvious damage to find components that could be repurposed. "This pressure valve," she explained, extracting the part from what had once been a water reclamation system. It's rated for twice the pressure your atmospheric systems would need. We can adapt it to regulate flow in your life support. Vel examined the valve with the expression of someone handling radioactive material. But it is not designed for our systems. The harmonics will be wrong. Then we make new harmonics. Mara said, "Look, your technology and ours might be based on different principles, but physics is physics. Pressure is pressure. Flow is flow. We just need to find the right interfaces." They worked through the morning, the Caliph gradually becoming more comfortable with the scavenging process. Mara noticed that Ziri, in particular, had a talent for spotting useful components, her crystalline eyes able to detect stress fractures and material fatigue that even Mara's scanners might miss. It was Ziri who made the first major discovery. They had ventured deeper into the valley, where the sand gave way to exposed bedrock. Half buried in a drift was a structure that clearly wasn't part of any crashed vessel. "Captain," Ziri called, her musical voice carrying despite the wind. "This is architectural, not vehicular." Mara hurried over, her scanner already active. The readings made her whistle softly inside her helmet. "It's an old prospecting outpost. Human design. Probably 40 years old at least." She began clearing sand away from what looked like an access hatch. These were built to last. If the seals held, the hatch required the combined strength of 3 Caliph to break free from the accumulated grit. But when it finally swung open, Mara's hopes were rewarded. The interior was dusty but intact, preserved by the same conditions that made the planet so hostile to active technology. "Jackpot," she breathed, playing her light over the equipment inside. "They've got a fusion reactor core. It's old tech, but fusion is fusion. If we can get it running." Vel entered the outpost with the caution of someone expecting traps. "This structure has survived where our resonance failed." "How?" "Because it was built to work with the planet, not against it," Mara explained, running her hands over the reactor housing. "See these vents? They're designed to channel the dust storms, use them for cooling instead of fighting them. It's not pretty, but it works." The reactor core was a mass of pipes, cooling vanes, and magnetic containment systems that looked primitive compared to Caliph technology. But as Mara began her diagnostic procedures, she found that most of the systems were still functional. The builders had over-engineered everything, adding redundancy upon redundancy. "We'll need to clear the cooling system," she said, mapping out the work in her mind. "Replace some control circuits, probably fabricate new magnetic constrictors, but the core itself is solid." "Even if we can restore this device to function," Vel said, "how do we interface it with our systems? The energy output will be chaotic, unmodulated. Our crystals require precise harmonic frequencies. Mara grinned, the expression hidden inside her helmet. "Then we teach your crystals to dance to a different tune. Ziri, you understand both our languages, right? Technical as well as conversational." The younger Caliph nodded. "I have studied human technical specifications as part of my linguistic training." "Perfect. The reactor's control module uses an old Earth programming language. If you can help me decode it, we might be able to modify the output parameters to something your crystals can work with." They spent the next several hours in a strange collaboration. Mara worked on the physical components while Ziri interfaced with the control system through a portable terminal they'd salvaged from another wreck. The code was archaic, full of shortcuts and workarounds that spoke of frontier pragmatism rather than elegant design. "Your ancestors were creative in their solutions," Ziri observed, scrolling through lines of code. "This subroutine appears to be handling 3 different functions simultaneously." "Welcome to human engineering," Mara said, elbow deep in the reactor's cooling system. "We call it making do with what you've got." As they worked, other Caliph brought in salvaged materials under Mara's direction. She taught them to sort by potential function rather than origin. to see past surface damage to underlying utility. It was slow going at first, their crystalline precision at odds with the crude reality of scrap salvage. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of the younger engineers, who had initially been the most resistant to Mara's methods, discovered a cache of power cells in a crashed shuttle. They were damaged, leaking energy in patterns that would have made them useless for their original purpose. But as he held one up to the fading light, his crystalline skin resonated with the chaotic energy discharge. "Captain Reyes," he called, excitement overcoming his earlier skepticism. "These damaged cells, their output is uncontrolled, but it creates harmonics our crystals can partially process." Mara examined the cells, her mind already working through possibilities. "If we can channel that chaos, use it as a bridge between the fusion reactor and your systems." She looked up at Vel. "We'd need to build a completely hybrid system, part human tech, part Calith. It won't be pretty, and it definitely won't be perfect." Vel was quiet for a long moment, and Mara could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. Everything in his training, his culture, demanded perfection and purity of design, but his people were dying, and perfection wouldn't save them. "Show us what must be done," he said finally. They worked through the night, the Calith's natural luminescence providing enough light to continue even after Orcus 9's dim sun had set. Mara sketched out designs in the sand, explaining how they could create a framework that combined the best of both technologies. "We'll use scavenged hull plates for the basic structure," she explained. "Your crystals can be integrated at key points to channel and modulate the energy flow. The fusion reactor provides raw power. The damaged cells create the chaotic harmonics, and your crystals shape it into something useful." It was more than just technical work. As they labored together, Mara found herself sharing stories of other salvage operations, other times when adaptation had meant the difference between life and death. The Calith, in turn, spoke of their home world, where crystalline cities grew from seed crystals over centuries, each structure unique, yet a part of a greater harmony. "Your approach and ours are not so different," Ziri observed during a break. "We seek harmony through perfection. You seek it through adaptation. Perhaps there is wisdom in combining both." The work was interrupted by the first signs of a major storm building on the horizon. The wind picked up, carrying with it the distinctive ozone smell that preceded the worst tempests. Mara checked her meteorological sensors and swore softly. "We've got maybe 6 hours before a Category 3 hits," she announced. "We need to get everything under cover and batten down." The Calith worked with newfound urgency, their movements taking on an efficiency that came from understanding the stakes. They hauled salvaged materials into the shelter of the outpost, secured loose components, and began assembling what they could of the hybrid system's framework. As the storm approached, Mara made a disturbing discovery. The fusion reactor's coolant system, while functional, had a critical weakness. Sand infiltration through microscopic cracks had created blockages that would cause overheating under full load. "We need to clear these manually," she told Vel. "But that means someone has to go into the cooling tunnels during the storm." "That is suicide," Vel said flatly. "The wind speeds alone. The alternative is the reactor fails and we all die anyway." Mara countered. She was already checking her suit's reinforcements, adding extra plating where she could. "I've worked in storms before. It's dangerous, but it can be done." "This is not your responsibility," Vel said. "We are not your people. Why risk yourself for us?" Mara paused in her preparations. The question cut deeper than Vel could know. Images flashed through her mind. Another planet, another group of people in danger, another choice between safety and action. She'd chosen safety then, followed protocol, waited for proper authorization. 37 people had died while she waited. "Because I can help," she said simply. "That makes it my responsibility." The storm hit with a fury that made previous tempests seem gentle. Sand driven at hundreds of kilometers per hour could strip flesh from bone in seconds, and the charged particles in the air played havoc with electronics. But the cooling tunnels needed to be cleared, or everything they'd built would be for nothing. Mara entered the tunnels through an access port, her suit's headlamp barely penetrating the swirling dust. The blockages were worse than she'd feared, compacted sand fused into near concrete by years of thermal cycling. She worked with fusion cutter and pry bar, clearing sections inch by painful inch. Outside, the storm's howl rose to a shriek that penetrated even her suit's audio dampening. Her radiation detector clicked ominously as charged particles found their way through the shielding. She had perhaps an hour before exposure became critical. A massive gust shook the entire structure, and for a moment, Mara thought the tunnels might collapse. Sand poured through new cracks, threatening to undo all her work. She redoubled her efforts, but it was clear she wouldn't be able to clear all the blockages in time. That's when she heard movement behind her. Vel had followed her into the tunnels, his crystalline form naturally more resistant to the radiation but still vulnerable to the physical battering of the storm. "I cannot let you face this alone," he said, adding his strength to hers as they attacked a particularly stubborn blockage. "Your adaptation has shown me that sometimes perfection means accepting imperfection." Together, they cleared the critical sections just as Mara's exposure alarm began its urgent warning. They retreated to the safety of the outpost, where the other Caliph waited with visible relief. "The reactor is clear," Mara reported, fighting exhaustion. "We can bring it online as soon as the storm passes." But the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it was intensifying, escalating from Category 3 to Category 4 and showing signs of pushing toward the deadly Category 5 level. The outpost shook under the assault, and even its over-engineered structure began to show strain. "We cannot wait," Vel decided. "If the storm destroys our work before we can test it..." Mara understood. They'd have to attempt the reactor startup in the middle of the tempest, with no chance to properly test their hybrid system. It was the kind of desperate gamble she'd once have avoided, but desperate times called for desperate measures. They divided into teams. Mara and 2 Caliph engineers worked on the reactor itself, bringing it online stage by careful stage. Vel and the others assembled the hybrid framework, welding human hull plates together with crystalline conduits in patterns that no designer would ever have envisioned. The reactor's startup sequence was a lesson in controlled chaos. Without proper computer control, they had to manage each phase manually, watching gauges and adjusting valves by hand. The ancient machinery protested, coughing and wheezing like a dying beast before finally catching its rhythm. "Power output stable," Mara announced, watching the readings with hawk-like intensity. Feeding to the hybrid system now. This was the critical moment. The chaotic energy from the damaged power cells met the steady output of the fusion reactor within the crystalline matrix the Caliph had assembled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the crystals began to glow, their light shifting through spectrums as they found harmony within chaos. "It's working," Ziri breathed, her voice filled with wonder. "The patterns are unlike anything in our teachings, but they're stable." The celebration was short-lived. The storm reached Category 5 intensity, and the outpost's structure began to fail. Sand forced its way through growing cracks, and the howl of the wind rose to painful levels even through their protection. "We need to get to the ship," Vel decided. "Transfer the hybrid core before the outpost collapses." It was a desperate race against time. They disconnected the hybrid system, each component precious and irreplaceable. The journey from the outpost to the Caliph vessel was only 100 meters, but in the storm it might as well have been kilometers. They formed a chain, passing components from person to person, using their bodies to shield the delicate equipment from the worst of the sand blast. Mara took the lead, her experience in storm conditions helping her find the path of least resistance. Halfway to the ship, disaster struck. A piece of debris, probably hull plating from some long-dead vessel, came spinning out of the storm like a massive blade. It struck the engineer carrying the central power coupling, sending him tumbling. The component flew from his grasp, about to be lost in the maelstrom. Without thinking, Mara lunged for it. The impact knocked her off her feet, and for a moment she was airborne, the storm ready to claim her. But Calith's hands caught her, pulled her back, their crystalline strength anchoring her against the wind. "Together," Vel said, his voice carrying despite the storm. "Your adaptation, our precision. Together, we are stronger." They made it to the ship, though barely. The Calith vessel's organic-looking airlock irised open to admit them, sealing out the worst of the storm. Inside, the damage from the resonance failure was even more evident. Whole sections of the crystalline structure were dark, their light extinguished. "Where do we install the hybrid core?" Mara asked, surveying the alien architecture. Vel led her to what had been the resonance chamber, now a shattered ruin of broken crystals. "Here, we must remove the failed matrix and integrate your hybrid system in its place." It was delicate work, made more challenging by the ship shaking under the storm's assault. They had to cut away damaged crystal, each removal causing visible pain to the Calith as their technology was literally carved away, but they endured, understanding that survival required sacrifice. The installation was a fusion of techniques that would have horrified purists from both species. Mara welded human components directly to crystalline structures, while the Calith grew new crystal formations around mechanical parts. The younger engineer who had first discovered the damaged power cells proved particularly adept at finding ways to merge the two technologies. "I was wrong to resist," he admitted to Mara as they worked. "I saw only the impurity of your methods, not the strength in your willingness to use whatever works." Time was running out. The storm was beginning to affect even the Calith vessel's structure, and their improvised power system was their only hope of escape. They made the final connections with shaking hands, triple-checking each junction. "Initiating power transfer," Mara announced. "Everyone stand back." The hybrid core came to life with a sound that was part mechanical hum, part crystalline chime. Energy flowed through pathways that no engineer had ever designed, finding its own balance between order and chaos. The ship's systems began to respond, lights flickering on throughout the vessel. "Hull integrity restored," one of the Calith reported. "Life support functioning. Propulsion systems operational." They had done it. Against all odds. They had created something entirely new, a fusion of two technological philosophies that by all rights should have been incompatible. But success brought a new challenge. They had to launch immediately, before the storm could damage their fragile hybrid system. "Everyone secure for launch," Vel commanded. "Captain Reyes, will you assist with navigation? Our systems are functional, but different now." Mara took a position at what she thought was a navigation console, though the controls were unlike anything she'd seen. Ziri stood beside her, translating the readouts and helping her understand the new hybrid interface. The launch sequence was a symphony of controlled chaos. The fusion reactor roared, its power channeled through crystalline matrices into propulsion systems that had never been designed for such crude energy. The ship shuddered, protested, and then, miraculously, began to rise. Through the viewports, Mara could see the storm in all its fury. Sand and debris swirled in patterns that would have torn an unprotected human to pieces in seconds. But their hybrid vessel, ugly and imperfect as it was, punched through the chaos with a determination that seemed almost alive. They broke through the upper atmosphere just as the storm reached its peak intensity. Below them, Orcus 9 writhed under a blanket of dust that obscured entire continents. They had escaped by the narrowest of margins. "Course plotted for the nearest inhabited system," Mara reported. "The hybrid drive should hold long enough to reach civilization." Vel approached her, and she could see the profound change in his bearing. Where once there had been rigid certainty, now there was something more flexible, more open. "Captain Reyes," he said formally, "you have saved my people. More than that, you have taught us a new way of thinking. We are in your debt." "No debt," Mara said firmly. "We saved each other. That's what people do." Vel reached into a compartment and withdrew something that made Mara's breath catch. It was a crystal, perfect in its imperfection, its structure showing the same hybrid characteristics as their ship. Light played through it in patterns that seemed to bridge the gap between order and chaos. "This is for you," he said, placing it in her hands. "A symbol of what we have learned together, in our culture. Such crystals are grown over centuries, each one unique. This one grew in ours, born from necessity and adaptation. It is not perfect by our old standards, but perhaps it represents a new kind of perfection." Mara held the crystal up to the light, watching the play of colors within its depths. She thought of the 37 colonists she'd failed to save, of the years she'd spent running from that failure. This crystal, imperfect and beautiful, represented something she'd lost and found again, the willingness to risk everything for the chance to help others. "Thank you," she said softly, "for trusting me, for being willing to try something different." "The question now," Ziri interjected, her young voice filled with possibility, "is what else might be achieved when different peoples combine their strengths? How many other impossible problems might be solved through cooperation?" Mara smiled, looking out at the stars that surrounded them. Each point of light represented a system, a world, a potential for new connections and collaborations. The galaxy suddenly seemed full of possibilities. "I think," she said, "that's a question worth exploring." The hybrid ship continued its journey through space, its mismatched systems humming in unexpected harmony. Behind them, Orcus 9 spun on, unchanged and unchanging, waiting to test the next visitors to its hostile shores. But for 6 Caliph and 1 human, the planet had provided something invaluable. Proof that survival sometimes requires abandoning perfection in favor of adaptation, and that the greatest innovations often come from the most unlikely collaborations. As they entered hyperspace, the stars elongating into streams of light, Mara found herself thinking about the future. She'd spent so long looking backward, defining herself by her failures. But the Caliph had shown her something important. Sometimes the most profound transformations came not from achieving perfection, but from embracing imperfection and finding strength in adaptation. The crystal in her hands pulsed with gentle warmth, a reminder of what could be achieved when different approaches merged. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive with possibility. And sometimes, Mara reflected, that was the most perfect thing of all. Weeks later, when they finally reached the space station orbiting Kepler 442b, their arrival caused quite a stir. A Caliph vessel powered by human technology was unprecedented, and the hybrid crystal Mara carried drew xenotechnologists from across the sector. But more important than the technology were the stories they brought. Tales of cooperation in the face of catastrophe, a perfection found in imperfection. The Caliph formally requested human engineering consultants to help them develop more adaptive technologies. Human companies began studying crystalline resonance principles to improve their own designs. It was the beginning of a new era of cooperation, all stemming from a desperate gamble on a hostile world. Mara found herself at the center of it all. No longer just a salvage operator, but a bridge between 2 ways of thinking. She established a new operation, one that specialized in solving problems through technological fusion. The hybrid crystal sat on her desk, a constant reminder that the best solutions often came from the most unlikely combinations. One day, Vel visited her office. He had adapted well to the changes, becoming a leading advocate for what they now called adaptive precision, the melding of Caliph perfectionism with human pragmatism. "I have been thinking," he said, settling his tall frame into a chair designed for humans. About what you said on Orcus 9, that perfection is a luxury, but adaptation keeps us breathing. Still believe that, Mara said. Even more now. I would propose a modification, Vel said, his crystalline features catching the light from her office window. Perhaps perfection is not a luxury to be abandoned, but a direction to be pursued through adaptation. We need not choose between them. Mara considered this, turning the hybrid crystal in her hands. Perfection through imperfection? Evolution through synthesis, Vel corrected. Your people have a saying, perfect is the enemy of good. But perhaps it need not be an enemy if we understand that the path to perfection is paved with good enough solutions that work. It was a profound shift in thinking for both their species. The Caliph began to see their crystalline perfection not as an end state, but as one point on a spectrum of possibilities. Humans started to appreciate that their makeshift solutions could be stepping stones to something greater rather than just temporary fixes. The collaboration spread beyond technology. Caliph artists began incorporating human chaos theory into their crystalline sculptures, creating works that grew and changed over time. Human musicians discovered that crystalline resonance could create harmonies impossible with traditional instruments. Even cuisine evolved, with hybrid dishes that combined the structured precision of Caliph food preparation with the experimental flair of human cooking. But perhaps the most significant change was in how both species approached problems. Where once the Caliph would have spent years perfecting a solution before implementation, they now launched prototypes and refined them through use. Where humans might have cobbled together quick fixes without thought for longevity, they now considered how their adaptations might evolve into something more permanent. Mara often thought back to Orcus 9, to that desperate struggle against sand and storm. What had seemed like a disaster had become a catalyst for transformation. The planet that broke things down had ultimately shown them how to build things up in new ways. Years passed. The hybrid technology born from desperation became the foundation for a new generation of spacecraft that could adapt to any environment. Colony ships that could reshape themselves based on the worlds they found. Exploration vessels that could survive conditions that would have destroyed conventional craft. All because 6 Caliph and 1 human had been willing to try something different. Mara eventually returned to Orcus 9. This time as part of a joint expedition to establish a permanent research station. The planet's storm still raged. Its sand still sought to tear down anything that dared to stand. But now they had technology that could dance with the chaos rather than resist it. Standing on the same spot where she'd first met the Caliph, Mara held up the hybrid crystal. It had grown over the years, its structure becoming more complex as it absorbed energy and experience. It was no longer the small token Vel had given her, but something unique. Something that could only have existed because 2 different ways of thinking had collided and merged. "Still think perfection's overrated?" Ziri asked, joining her on the observation deck. The young Caliph had become a leader in the new hybrid technologies, her linguistic skills making her uniquely suited to bridging the gap between different systems of thought. "I think," Mara said slowly, "that perfection isn't a state but a process. And that process requires both precision and adaptation, both planning and improvisation. The Orcus principle," Ziri said with a smile. "From chaos and order, something new." They watched the sun set over the red sands, its light refracting through dust particles in patterns that were never the same twice. Somewhere out there, buried under dunes and time, were the wrecks of ships that had tried to impose their will on this world. But here, in a station that bent with the wind and drew power from the storms, humans and Caliph worked side by side to unlock the planet's secrets. The universe was vast and full of challenges that no single approach could solve. But as Mara had learned on this hostile world, sometimes the answer wasn't to be perfect or to adapt, but to find the harmony between both. In that harmony lay the future, imperfect and beautiful, chaotic and ordered, and absolutely alive with possibility.